Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. Just to, it's it's the day before Valentine's Day. I got myself sorted because I was wandering around seeing all these guys with flowers. Thinking, why are these guys walking around with flowers? Because I've been away for work this week, and I'm sort of just glad to get back late last night. And I said, oh man, it's Valentine's Day, so I got myself sorted today, amongst other things, and doing Amazon returns for my wife and stuff. She'd ordered all this stuff, then doesn't want it, and then we got some stuff in sort of like the flat where one of our daughters lives, and so it's been one out because I was hoping to do this early morning, in the sunshine, So, but unfortunately not. It's actually still really freezing cold, but even though it's middle of February, it's sort of like it's quite inclement at the moment. It's sort of like temperatures going down. We might have some snow at the weekend. So what I want to do today is it's a really, again, it's not sort of like something that you'd expect perhaps a philosopher to talk about overtly, but it's something that has enormous philosophical implications. And it's the relationship it's the relationship of the Christian believer to the law of God, or the law of Moses, or the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. All those words are appropriate. Now I would encourage somebody who hasn't, doesn't necessarily think, oh gosh, he's gone doing another religious video. I would say this is something which is really interesting to have in even if you've got, you think your faith's well established, or you've got no faith or whatever. This is something really useful, I think, this subject to have in your toolbox, so that, because this is something which I think is really under talked about. It was something that was very, very controversial within the Reformed world during the perhaps from the late from when, say, the mid 1950s, I think, was the first sort of commentary on this, and the person who made that commentary was somebody called R.J. Rushdoony. He really precipitated very much a renaissance in reform thinking, reform philosophy, and really considering the importance of the law of God and its place within the consciousness of not just of a believer, but it has enormous political implications, because he was very much dealing with, what's the role of all? Because if you read the books of Moses, and when you've got Genesis, which is obviously first things, which is very much a narrative book, sort of telling the story, the early history of the patriarchs, and then you've got Exodus, which is very much sort of like the story of what happened to the nation which became Israel. The Exodus story of leaving Egypt, leaving as slaves, and what's really useful, by the time you get past, those sort of 9, 10, 11, when you start getting, say, what God, you've got the 10 Commandments, and then you've got all these other laws and discussions within the narrative, and the amazing thing, then you got sort of like the book of Numbers, which is, as it say, there's lots of enumerations, lots of sentences going on, but there's loads of stuff sort of like threaded through that through that book, which has ethical implications, and that's what I think people tend to miss. This is God speaking to a nation, and who are slaves, who have a slave mentality, who've never governed themselves, and he's actually telling them, starting from, this total base level, they've just been slaves and dependent for all this time, of how to run a nation. And when you get to sort of like to Deuteronomy, and especially the early chapters, you read in the early sort of like chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses is just about to leave, and God's told him that, Moses had a real sort of anger problem, which is encouraging for us, those of us who have an anger problem, who deal with, but it's also a warning, because, he lost his temper with the people who are being really, disobedient unsubmissive and subversive, and he just lost his temper with them, and as a result of that incident, it's an incident where the Lord told him to speak to the rock, and water would come out of the rock when people were complaining about thirst. And it said that Moses just lost his sort of like temper, took his staff, which is the sign of the authority of God, and hit the rock, and water started coming out of the rock. He said, have you rebels, have I got to show? He just lost it. And he, in a sense, he misrepresented God before the people. And the Lord sort of took that really very sort of like personally and said to Moses, because you've done that, you're going to lead the people up to the promised land, but you're never actually going to go into the promised land. And so he lost that sort of part of his destiny, and, which is a real, sobering fact for, for anyone you think about it. Let me just check if this is on. Yes, it is good. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure this was connected. I don't want to talk for sort of like for 2 hours. I realised the microphone's not switched on. That's what that little green light is telling me it's on. So I really want to speak a little bit about our relationship to the law of God, and whether or not it has any applicability for today. Because when people think about that, they immediately think, oh, this was the culture that God was trying to talk to the people about and get them to understand and to understand relations. Because I'm just reading Deuteronomy at the moment as part of my normal reading. I've just been reading those early books just in sort of, I just like to read sort of like, read the scriptures sequentially. I don't follow any plan or anything. I just literally read them sequentially. And I like to try and get through, I certainly get, try and get around, the scriptures at least once a year. And so I'm just sort of like reading through those again, and it's amazing reading sort of like Deuteronomy, and you're seeing how it's so easy to just skip over because of the way the narrative is. It's so easy to actually skip over. Right? Why is the Lord saying, this? Why is he saying? Why is he instructing them in this way? Why is, what's he saying? And because the Apostle Paul, in some of his quotes from Deuteronomy, is very, very creative in his, in his use of what the narrative says. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's narrative, you've got like surface meaning, and you've got the literal meaning. Like, say, for example, you shall not muzzle an ox when he's treading the grain. And to the surface reading and the surface meaning of that is, you shall not, you shall not, because they used to pull the oxes would be pulling, and the grain would be there, and they'd be sort of like trampling over it, and it'll be getting into the soil. And so what is actually sort of like saying is that, obviously the natural instinct of a hungry ox is going to be to eat some of this grain. So people would muzzle their animals to stop them from eating stuff. But what, there's a little bit of ecology there, isn't there? And that's the interesting thing. There's so much in sort of like in Deuteronomy where it's talking about how to treat the land, how to farm the land, how to rotate it. There's all this amazing wisdom about farming, about, how to leave land fallow for a number of years. It's sort of couched in what you might call cultic language, if you like, it's got like a spiritual flavor at times to the language, and say you will not defile the land but actually it's giving a lot of wisdom about the farmland. That's what happened. People over farm land, don't they? Over intensely farm land, and they don't let it fallow, and the land, then they have to chuck loads of fertilizer and stuff. So there's lots of really interesting practical implications of what's going on in these books. That's the thing. I think you can just think of it. If you think of them as religious books, you lose a lot of the wisdom and understanding that's actually in these books. So, just to actually treat them differently and look and that's partly because it is narrative. It is God speaking about sort of like himself, and the people, the chroniclers have put this sort of flavor to it. But you can actually, when you analyze it, when you sort of like say, what is this actually saying? It is amazingly interesting. So, but what's actually sort of there's two things really I want to do. I'm not sure how many. I'm not sure whether this will end up being broken up into quite a number of different videos. It might end up being a series. I've got that feeling. There's so much to talk about here, and because it's actually quite late already, I don't think I'll be able to do everything in one go tonight because I have to work tomorrow. So, but I am going to pursue this. I was sort of. It was a long drive home, sort of like last night, 7-8 hours. So I was listening to some sort of like material for this as well. In between listening to Dan Bongino and Megyn Kelly and else, I was sort of like listening to, studies in theonomy by sort of like Dr. Greg Bahnsen, which I will actually upload those, audio files and put a link in the description so anybody who wants them can get them, because they really are, exceptional quality of study. I mean, Theonomy and Christian Ethics, which is the Dr. Bunsen's famous book. He departed the earth too early, heart sort of complications. As a relatively young, sort of like a relatively young man, and it was a great loss to the scholarly world in general, because he was a great debater, and he debated at sort of like the University of California. I think you can still get some of his debates on there. He used to, engage atheist debaters, and he did his PhD at the University, I think, of Southern California, and he was well appreciated and well recognized. And as a scholar, whether you agreed with him or not wasn't the point, but he was recognized as somebody very, very confident. He's very, very thorough, very, very analytical. He was trained as an analytical philosopher. And he's very, and you can tell, so I know he went under, I think there was a period of a few years where he was under intense scrutiny and intense persecution, and the seminaries which he was supposed to be part of as a lecturer, they all disputed his thesis and it got very quite unpleasant and personal. And there are recordings of him where he's responding to this criticism, and I think there's one in particular where you can tell he's really, really provoked, but he goes at it in such a rigorous analytical, like he just gets a philosophical machine guns out and just nails these people to the wall. And it's I will try and get that link out, because there is a series where he responded to all his criticism, because in many ways that was his earlier work. He's much more known in his later period as an apologist and for developing Van Tillian apologetics. But Theonomy, which is something I want to talk about, sort of like that perspective, which was the classical Puritan, Presbyterian. If you know anything about Presbyterians, the Westminster Confession, which is one of the finest, I think you get the shorter version, long version, but it's one of the finest sort of expositions, and in many ways a statement, a Christian philosophical statement about the nature of man and how we should organize our society. And it was the founding sort of, in a sense, the biblical principles that are found within that document, which were the Puritans envisaged a new world. Is why the States is as the States is today, is because of that Puritan influence. We can, it was part of the founding thread, and the influence of, Roger Williams and his attitude to religious pluralism, religious tolerance and stuff that defined the US. So these aren't sort of like abstract things and things that have no consequence to us today. We tend to, because of the secularization of our culture and the vested interest of people who've been pushing secularism, which is bankrupt in many ways. And it's, we should really know the history of the 20th century was the secular century, and there was more bloodshed in that century than probably most of the other centuries put together. It wasn't a triumph for secularism or atheism. There's no, we shouldn't be, intellectually intimidated by this stuff. New atheists are extremely loud, but they're also extremely ignorant. What's happening with Dawkins is actually quite interesting at the moment. So he's now calling himself a I think he's calling himself a social Christian or something. So he's somebody that believes in the social values of Christianity. Was it social? That's not quite right. He was calling that's the basic implication of what he's actually saying. So even though he's, he hasn't renounced his atheism or something, he's actually says that the values within the Christian society and Christian and what the, he's saying that those are the right sort of like values, of sort of like of tolerance and a lot. It's very refreshing when there are some honest atheists out there who actually will nevertheless will say, I mean, Richard Rorty said this as well, which is very interesting as a philosopher. He actually said that the basic moral teachings of Christianity and the Christian way of looking at the world is what defined the West. It really did define the West. And it also inspired, people, who are not part of the West, who took on parts of Western culture. This actually came out of Christianity. There's that wonderful study. I think it's called How Christianity Changed the World. He was a University of Chicago, I think, professor, and it's very famous study where he just enumerates how the Christian values influenced and changed the attitude to women, changed the attitude to society, what is valuable, changed the environment. There's a whole stream of stuff that people don't realize and just take for granted because it's been secularized. But where the ideas came from, a lot of people don't realize that, say, the early trade union movement, it was, they basically came from the levelers and the diggers who were egalitarian Christian groups that came out of Oliver Cromwell, who's a very famous sort of figure in British history. For a very brief period, we had a protectorate where the king, I think maybe it was Charles I, I think he got his head chopped off. Oliver Cromwell, English Revolution sort of time period, established a protectorate. I mean, unfortunately, it only lasted about 6 or 7 years. Charles II made this to their everlasting shame. As a Scot, I can say this, to the Scottish Presbyterians' everlasting shame. They made a ally with Charles II and got him back on the throne, in return for a promise that, the Presbyterian order of church will be throughout the land. And as soon as Charles II got back in, he basically evicted them all. He betrayed everybody. He evicted them all the ministers from there. Yeah. And in many ways, that was the death of unfortunately, that was the spiritual death of our nation. But it was, as far as the world was concerned, it was the birth of the American nation, because the Puritans and who came, who were Presbyterians, and it's a complicated story in its own right. But the Puritans who were going for religious freedom understood that the only way they could have religious freedom is they would have to leave Europe, and they, stopping off. I mean, interesting thing had happened in Amsterdam, in Amsterdam as part of the Netherlands, Holland. Holland is actually regions of the Netherlands. Netherlands is actually, but often people just call it Holland. It's an interesting a bit of historical confusion. Sometimes people don't understand that Holland is actually just parts. There's parts of Holland. It's part of the Netherlands. Netherlands is but that Netherlands had become a strong. They'd been persecuted by the Spanish, who were basically the Catholics in the Spanish at that time, where the Pope's private army. He crowned the emperor of the King of Spain as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his job was to go and to get rid of all the heretics throughout Europe. And he persecuted the Dutch Protestants and they tried to destroy all the dikes. Most of the Netherlands is actually under sea level, and they built up these dikes to reclaim the land. And the Spanish were breaking down all these dikes, trying to basically flood and drown the people. And the Dutch had sort of like sent a message to the surrounding Spanish army, sort of like saying that we'd rather drown and eat rats than than submit to the Pope, which was, that's still the spirit of the Dutch in many ways today. You can't tell them what to do. It's sort of like, which is a good and a bad thing, but you can see, but this sort of like that character of not of not giving up, of being stubborn, of having the right to have your own relationship with, you've got a right to have your own relationship and connection to God without going through some sort of hierarchy. Very much a Protestant idea. None of these papists or this priesthood nonsense. We've got an individual right to have a relationship with God, and that's sort of like translated into, when that gets secularized, isn't it? It's a very strong, rugged individualism. Same in the US, the very strong rugged. We're here as pioneers in the frontier, on the new frontier, and it sort of like gets into the psyche of people, sort of this very strong, rugged individualism. So I hope, that's sort of like a little bit of a background of sort of like why I want to sort of to talk about this sort of like this subject, because it really has, it's one of these sort of like themes within that people don't really appreciate. It's sort of, it's in the background of why our culture is like our culture, and why our relationship to, say, the law of God, and why that's so important. And it's also the issue, when I was thinking about this, first of all, it was also the issue of tithing within the Christian consciousness, because tithing is one of those things that really, really provokes people. It's like there's people who, written whole books about just, of the evils of tithing, and, how it's in the law. It's not for New Testament believers. I mean, it's something that's, there's people that have done whole series, who consider themselves Bible teachers and did sort of like a number of series, and they're only the only thing of theirs that you can still get on the internet is when they criticized tithing. People sort of like 10, 15 years ago, self-styled, considered themselves, teachers, Bible teachers, and they sort of like did all. They sort of like had their, early sort of, almost, it's a bit like an early, it's not quite a podcast, but it's sort of like, it's like people just filmed themselves sort of talking about different, they considered themselves sort of like independent, sort of like Bible teachers, but the only thing you can find of theirs is their books and their series on the internet about tithing. And the great irony of some of these messages is that, you go onto those websites, because my wife my wife's got her own reasons as to why she has some problems with tithing, and that's to do with her life as a single mother and her experience within the church, and how the church would demand, they would preach on tithing, and they would make it like, it's like, your sacred duty. You had to give, say, 10% of your income to the church, and if not, you were. I'm speaking hyperbolically here to just to make the point, but this is not too much off the point for some churches really do actually believe this. It's like it's as if if you're sort of like you're damning yourself, and you're robbing God by not tithing, and therefore tithing is very much something you do first. You do it you do it gross, on your gross income, and so 10% of your income goes to your local church, and that's it. No discussions, nothing. It's just like it's almost like God's taxing you. And so she's had a very bad experience of that, I think, within her with the church that she was involved in. They were very legalistic about it. It was very much considered something you had to do, and therefore she was struggling as a as a single mum with 3 daughters. And so, if anything, when you think about it, the church should have been helping her and providing and ensuring that, because she was the wounded party in that. There's, I don't want to betray too much of, what went on, but she was very much the wounded party in the relationship. I'm divorced. I had similar experience. I was the wounded party, from our, you're not perfect. There's always, but but there is blame, isn't there? There's that you can apportion blame in situations like that. If one party's sort of like committing adultery, then they're at fault. There's no ifs and buts or maybes about that. You've destroyed your marriage relationship when that happens. So she had her own reasons, and she'd listened to sort of like one of these guys on tithing. This series, I think it was like 10 sort of, probably, I don't know, maybe 10 hours or something of material. And she said, "Oh, you have to listen to this because this is really good." And, and he was basically sort of like anti-tithing. He'd come out against it. And I think maybe the first 3 or 4, it was quite interesting listening, because he had like lots of these details about what the tithe was and how they did the tithing. And he dealt with some of the, perhaps some of the details around tithing, which people sometimes push, and which was okay. It was, but by sort of the late ones, something on the inside of me really started to sort of like bulk at what he was saying. And so, it was for me, my final response to it, I think, was, because I did listen to them all, because I said to her that I would actually listen to all. And, but I think my final response was at the end was that I ended up giving probably one of the biggest offerings I'd ever given. I just thought, I reacted. I said, no, this is, I felt on the inside of me that this is the opposite. It's absolutely true that you should give to God because you want to give to God. It's like, that's perhaps one of the distinctive things about, say, the relationship of a new covenant believer. One of the things that is very most distinctive is that, in a sense, but God's not looking for people to worship him because they have to. He's looking to people who want to worship because they want to. This is part of, and even I think you can take this from the story of the book of Job. This is one of the great spiritual lessons in the book of Job, because the Satan figure, however you think about the Satan figure in the book of Job, one of the things he would actually was saying to God was that if Job only worships you because of all the things you do for him. He doesn't worship you because of you. And he said, and the way you can find that this is true is that if you strip him of everything that he's got, then he'll curse you to your face. And that is the message of Job. And there's 2 or 3 different iterations of that, isn't there? Satan comes back because God says, "All right, fine, right, but don't take his life." And so these disasters happen to Job. He loses everything. And then, but he doesn't renounce God. And you see this second sort of thing in the narrative where Satan comes to God again and says, "Oh, skin for skin, a man will do anything for his health. If you strip him and take away all his health, then he'll curse you to your face." And so this happens again. God says, "You're not allowed to kill him, but he's under, he's under your, he's in a sense, God's giving him authority in, within bounds, and Satan goes and attacks him. But although Job gets astonishingly depressed, and you have this great narrative, and it's one of the high water points of human, I think it's recognized as a piece of literature. It's one of the high watermarks of the piece of literature, the book of Job. It really is a really, really searching, asking the question, why is there evil in the world? And, what's God's relationship with evil, and why do the righteous suffer? And, people tend to, especially in the tradition that I'm in, they tend to they can't handle the Book of Job very well because of its message. But we'll have to leave that for some other time because the Book of Job is amazing. But one of the things is that, the messages of that book is that we should offer to God because we love God, not because we have to. I think that's one of the messages of that book. So that's not to negate, having said all that is not to negate the principle of the tithe and how important it is. And that's one of the things I'll be looking at, is actually understanding, where does it come from? Is it part of the law? Because often one of the immediate dismissals of tithing is, it's something that's in the law and therefore it's not relevant for us today because it was part of the law. And so, that is one of the most common criticisms that you will hear of tithing. And I will say, there is tithing within the framework of the law, but tithing is not part of the law. Tithing is a spiritual principle. It's not a cultic principle or part of there was a particular interpretation of tithing within the Jewish cult, which is, when you say the Jewish cult, you just mean all the rituals and that are associated with bringing the offerings, bringing the sacrifices, bring all the stuff that's to do with how the people were instructed to relate to God through the priesthood. That's the cult. And so, so there is an interpretation of tithing and the way tithing works within, if you like, the cult of Israel. But tithing itself as a spiritual principle is something that predates the law, and it's also something that should be within the experience of the Christian. It's the interpretation and the manner of doing it is different. And that's part of what I want to sort of like to look at, is to consider the relationship between the Christian and the law, because I'm getting stuck with my words here, aren't I? One of the most important things to understand is that that when we say the law, and this is where the confusion comes across, because if you look at, say, in Matthew 5:17 to 19, I've got it queued up here because I want to. This is part of how what Jesus says about the law, and because it says here, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Now, there is a textual problem with this word fulfill, which I will talk about. But but the immediate point is, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Okay. And then verse 18, it says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. Okay. So, but one of the most common things that when people talk about our relationship with the law is that they will say, what Jesus meant here was that he was actually coming to fulfill everything, because that's what it says. Not what, until everything, nothing's going to pass away until all is fulfilled. But Jesus fulfilled it, therefore all the law passed away. But that makes nonsense of this verse, because it says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. Okay, and verse 19. So to re-emphasize this point, that there is a relationship between us and the law, it says, so anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. What was Jesus coming to do? He was coming to announce the new order, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. And so again, you can't just suddenly divorce yourself from the law, because it says here, so anyone who breaks the least of these commands and teaches them to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So there is obviously considered by the virtue of these verses alone, there is some sort of continuing relationship with the law, and we need to understand what the law is, and we need to understand what is meant by the law here, and what our ongoing continual relationship with the law is, and that will help us to understand, in a sense, to understand what tithing is, and then because we have this relationship with the law, and because, how I introduced this talk was when I was talking about Deuteronomy and looking at all the laws and everything, actually understanding, right, if this is God's prescription for how a nation should be run, how it should be governed, how disputes should be settled, how a building code should be, there's all this stuff in those. It's amazing how ecology, economy, all these sort of like these principles, and then to actually understand what does it say about crime and punishment and the penal, what the penal sanctions. There's so much of this stuff in it, and that's what really, in a sense, what's called theonomy. Theonomy is, formed from theos and nomos, the Greek words, and theos, the law, nomos, the law of God. So theos is God, nomos is the law, and so it's the law of God, which is contrasted with what you might call, the battle cry of the Enlightenment, autonomy, which is like auto and nomos. So you've still got the same word nomos, but auto, self, so self-government. So you've got the government of God, theonomy, and then you've got your self-government or self-law, autonomy. And so, we tend to consider, autonomy sort of like a good thing. And again, I'm not completely saying, that there's not something that is very, they're words that need context, but this contrasting between the law of God and then autonomy, which is man sort of like exalting his own self, that is something that is the fundamental contrast that helps us understand why this has such big philosophical implications. Because if you've got we find that was part of the, if you like, the secular Enlightenment, because what people need to understand is that there was a Christian Renaissance and there was a secular Renaissance, and there was a Christian Enlightenment and there was a secular Enlightenment, and these two streams are together. The Reformation was part of this great change in the way people considered, the great breaking up of the Hagonomy and the abuse of the Catholic Hagonomy. That breaking up is what the Reformation was trying to do. And in many ways, the sort of the secularization of the Reformation and the denial of the divine authority, all those things sort of like pulled out. These are real big philosophical themes that people don't tend to appreciate. So this is really, so as I go, I'm going to have sort of like a break here, because I think I managed to speak for 30, 45 minutes or whatever it is. Yep, 38 minutes. So, but that's, if you like, a preview of what I actually want to talk about, because I can see this being, three distinct bits, and it's like hooks into other stuff. I mean, this is very much some of what, this is very much what I was looking at when I was doing my master's thesis, and not so much my doctorate, but my master's was considered an exceptional piece of work. I got a special commendation from the university for it. So and I want to publish it. The PhD sort of book is now, I actually heard from the publisher again, sort of like it's now being copy edited by somebody. So it's close. It's probably still, well, when I say close, it's closer than it was. I think it's like, between 6 and 8 months away. The text has been done for but you can't get it published quicker than you can. So, but I want to get the master stuff sort of like published as well, which is why I want to do this, stuff that's concentrating, about theonomical terms and what people might call, this might be what an aspect, what people might call dominion theology, which which is sort of like a bit like the equivalent of it's a bit like when people sort of like talked about dominion theology. As far as theology is sort of like concerned, it's a bit like the equivalent of President Trump. Those people can get sort of like the equivalent of Trump derangement syndrome, where they, just because it says dominion theology, they react and go completely irrational and don't want to, anything that a dominion theologian might say, they're going to be on the opposite side of the argument. It's one of those things that's created such a reaction. It's, especially, sort of like during the sort of like the 80s, 90s, when in the sense that what people might loosely call the evangelical Christian world was beginning to come back in and develop some sort of political perspective, because they'd been in their own sort of like ghetto, since the 1920s, since the Scopes trial, what's called the Scopes evolution trial. People had retreated into sort of like into a ghetto and retreated from academia and retreated from engaging with culture other than to then evangelize people. They just thought, that Jesus is just about to come back. We just need to, grab people for the ark, and culture's apostate, and the Antichrist is coming. The world's finished. We just need to get people. Evangelism was the only thing that was happening, and so whereas dominion theology is the opposite of that in the sense it's actually saying that we need to engage in all aspects of culture to see where in the words in the one of my heroes in that respect, somebody called Abraham Kuyper, who did, I think it was 1898 when he actually did the lectures, and he does his wonderful things about how how the Christian perspective and Christian culture should be it has implications of things how to say to every sphere of life, and not in a Hegenomical sense or a sense of dominating or over it, because he was one of his great principles was something called sphere sovereignty, where he recognized that each discipline had its own principles and everything, but the responsibility of the Christian, or the responsibility is to actually think through, how do we go through this discipline consistent with the faith that we profess? There's a right and a wrong way to do science. I'm unequivocal and unabashed when I say that. There is a right and a wrong way of how to do engineering. And all this. How do we connect things? What does the Bible say about engineering? Does the Bible say anything about engineering? It actually does. That's the interesting. Or it talks about how to do things and how to conduct business in what you would say is the right way. And so these are very much, they're very much actually understanding how, what are the Ten Commandments? What are they? How do we apply the Ten Commandments? Because there's one there, if you are somebody that you might, something that was that was like a modernized version of the social gospel. One of the things people would sort of like would actually, was very popular at one time, sort of like, doing sort of like, had almost like a second coming in, sort of like in the 80s. Now some senior sort of like leaders got quite into this. And one of the things they would sort of say would be, well, God's told us, not to steal, but he hasn't defined theft for us. And so, and that, that is such a chronic misunderstanding. That is totally false, because the Ten Commandments, if you like, are statements of principle. And then you've got all these, you've got this enormous, narrative that flows from the other books of Moses that defines very, very, very clearly just what property is, just what theft is, just what stealing is. It's very, very clear. That is such a, but that's what people said. They basically wanted to, interpret, what the scripture says. They wanted to make it compatible with, with socialist and communist ideas. That's the long and the short of it, sort of. And so all those things, they're very much themes that I looked at during my masters, sort of, of the social gospel and the there's the modern social gospel, because you had, Reichenbach, the social gospel movement sort of up to sort of like say that from 1870 onwards, he was reacting to the extreme poverty in New York. But then you got sort of like the evangelicals, the new evangelicals and the evangelicals of the 70s and the 80s. Quite a few of them picked this up. And then we had this reaction to Trump as well, as some other people sort of like picked that up as well. They're sort of, wanting to have some sort of compatibility between what you might think of as socialist ideas with trying to get some sort of scriptural justification for these ideas. And so they are all sort of things that very much that I was doing in my masters, which I think, this is almost like an advert for what would be the second book. But these themes, I think, are stuff where I do want to talk about this stuff. So hopefully, that's giving sort of like an idea, but very briefly, I want to talk about for this particular series, those things are going to pop in and out depending what they are. But for this particular series, I want to talk about our relationship to the law of God, to the law of what we would call the law, the law and the prophets, or the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, whatever the Hebrew scriptures, all basically equivalent terms, and the new covenant believer, or the Christians who believe in the New Testament, or depending what particular stream you are here, or what's our relationship. So it's what is our relationship to the law, and then specifically to look at tithing, because I think that's I think it's that one's in a sense is. You could spend an enormous amount of time sort of like looking at the details of either of those two. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give like a high level view to distill down exactly what the issues are, and then to push a particular point and say, this is the correct perspective. I'm not, there's details where there's plenty of space for people to have differing views on how to tithe and what does tithing mean. And it's fine. But it's absolutely correct that people should tithe. There's no ifs and buts or perhaps maybes about it. It's absolutely correct that they should. The scripture is very clear on the necessity of tithing. Now, I'm not, we'll be going into sort of like you're doing it from a willing heart and all this sort of other stuff that might come up, but just considering it objective, leaving aside all those subjective elements of it, how important it is. In many ways, the subjective element, you might say, has come very much more in for the new covenant believers. It's very much more to do with what's going on in your heart, giving from your heart. But the objective component of it is what is tithing, and why should we tithe? What's the biblical basis for it? So there we are. Right, there we are, 48 minutes. I'm sure I've already sort of commented that I should have stopped and had a break. So I am definitely going to have a break now, but I will be back to talk a bit more, because I think I can go for another hour or so before I have to think about tomorrow. Okay, God bless. See you shortly.